Welcome, everyone. So glad you're all here today. So, today we are diving into the psychology of money in leadership, a topic that sits right at the intersection of how we think, how we lead, and how the two influence each other. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to mention something that feels especially relevant today. Research shows that nearly 70% of team engagement is directly tied to the manager, yet more than a third of managers feel unprepared for the people side of leadership. That gap matters. And it's exactly why, beyond these webinars, we also offer leadership development programs designed to meet leaders wherever they are. Whether you're stepping into leadership for the first time or you're already leading and looking to go deeper. I will be pasting a link in the chat box where you can learn more about our leadership development programs. And if you know an organization which is looking to maybe introduce that, or if you happen to work in such an organization, please feel free to reach out to us. Now, as for today's webinar, we have Ajay Soni with us. Ajay has spent over 25 years in senior finance and operating roles, including serving as CFO for Cisco and in leadership roles across several startups. He's also an ACC certified coach, bringing together leadership, finance, and coaching. Today, he works with professionals at crossroads who are navigating career transitions, significant financial decisions, or simply pausing to ask what comes next. Welcome, Ajay. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We also have Smita with us today. She's a PCC and an ACTC coach. She designs and delivers leadership development programs and is also the director of sales and administration at Coacharya. She will be facilitating today's discussion. Welcome, Smita. Over to you.
Thank you, Yamini. Amazing. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. This discussion on psychology of money, I'm sure to most of you as leaders and as coaches, is intriguing, and to find out as to what we're going to cover today. As coaches, we love questions, so we are definitely going to start with two reflective questions for us. But before that, I would really like to extend warm welcome to Ajay. Ajay has enough and more background, and as CFO, and then shifted his role to being a coach. So the experiential part with money was during his stint as a CFO, and then now, based on that experience, he's bringing in the lens of a coach. So we are going to look at that, and that's what this session would be about. There will be a bit of frameworks based on his research around this, but as coaches, this is something which all of us have already we know the importance of awareness, we know the importance of recognition. We're just giving it the financial angle in this conversation today. So we're going to bring in some questions for you to reflect. So as we post those questions on the chat, to reflect along with us. Yeah. So that's the invitation from us to you. I'm sure you enjoy asking questions and also reflect on questions. All right. With that said, Yamini, can I request you to put the question, the Menti question on the chat, and also share your screen so that we can take a look at the outcome of the questions. Participants, the Menti link is on the chat for you to click on it and share your responses. Yamini, are you sharing your screen? Okay. Another 30 seconds for us to vote for your response. Interesting question. When you face a big decision involving money, what happens first? Okay. Ajay, do you want to wait for some more time? Okay, to move to the next question.
I think we can move to the next.
Okay.
I'll encourage everyone to respond. That way, at least we get a
Yes.
better view of it.
Thank you, Sarika. Okay, we have another question for you. And the second link is pasted by Yamini on the chat. Connected to how safe I feel. We encourage everyone to take that poll question and respond, please. So Ajay, as we were discussing, in the background, in the way the responses have come for both the questions, it really is not about, what is right and what is wrong, but basis our own, experiences with money and now the response, right? So there is no right or wrong answer. It's just about what our experiences has been. Basis that, I pick up an option here.
Absolutely. So I think, the questions are pretty simple. I think what it basically shows is that there is people are responding in a different way in terms of how they think about money, and which is exactly what we wanted to talk about as to it's not, we used to think that money is just about numbers and you just look at it and you decide. But basically, there is an emotion, there is a psychology angle to, how we look at money and relationship with money. And that's what I think this poll is also kind of showing, which is what, we'll cover as we go through the webinar.
Ajay, may I request you to come a little closer to the screen? The voice is not very clear for me. I don't know if others are also facing that.
Is it better now?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Yamini, maybe now you can take it to that first slide for Ajay to just take us, the journey for the next 50 minutes that we are in this conversation.
Sure. Just 2 minutes.
The next one, the journey slide. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what we are looking at is a framework. We're calling it the four mirrors to evaluate how do we look at relationship with money, right? And everybody has a unique relationship with money based on their story, based on how they have looked at it, the experience they've had. It also depends on your upbringing and your environment, right? So there is a lot of factors that go into it, but we're going to look at this framework, which is basically an insight framework, right? How do you get to an insight? Which is, you look at, you create awareness. So the first mirror is about awareness in terms of just understanding what it is. The second is about pattern recognition, which is, we recognize where it shows up, that this is a repeated behavior. Then we look at where is it coming from? What is the origin, right? And then we look at, we reflect back and saying, what can we do about it? So we're calling it the coach's mirror, which is where the integration in terms of bringing it all together is what we will look at. So that's basically just wanted to demystify this four mirrors framework, which is essentially an insight framework in terms of getting to understand our relationship with money. So we can get to the next slide. Um, I think this we already discussed. So I think we were discussing, Smita and I, that okay, what are some of the experiences I've had as a CFO for startup and some of the big companies. And I think a lot of you would have experience in terms of when the financial discussions happen, there is budget, which is a critical component in most of the organization, and there is a lot of emotion involved in terms of budget fights. So there are leaders who are fighting for lower revenue targets, but at the same time higher expense targets, right? So it's all about how they, feel about money rather than thinking from a company perspective. I'm just noticing the behaviors in terms of what I noticed. There is comparison in terms of looking at who's getting what, what's my headcount budget, what my expense budget. So basically there is some kind of a standing involved, and then, when people look at business and, the unnecessary discounts or pricing that was basically involved, which was more about, protecting. It's more about, what they can close rather than basically doing the right thing, right? So when you look at these are obviously things that you observe with, I've observed across organizations, across different leaders in different contexts. But so we wanted to put, uh, a psychology angle to it as a framework to understand what it is. How do you basically make sense of it? Obviously, when I was in those rooms having those discussions, I didn't have the benefit of, having these frameworks, and also didn't have, the coaching training. But I've always been interested in behavior, finance, and, the decision angles in terms of how people make decisions. And along with that, we will look at the coaching lens and how do we, basically look at these decisions. So, Yamini, can you go to the next slide? So when the decisions keep happening like that, right? When you keep happening this story, you notice that it's basically not, money is just the surface, right? It's not about the money per se. There is a personal angle. There is, the person underneath who's basically reacting to money in a certain way, right? So that is something where the psychology part comes in. And I think the other part which is critical is we talk about, why money has such a, factor. I mean, there are a lot of decisions that leaders take about strategy, about, like where to take the company. There are multiple other decisions about resourcing, about hiring, and all of that, right? Money basically removes the cushioning, right? So money, it is what it is. There is no hiding behind, uh, things about, like, I didn't have the right environment, or I didn't have, the right, so basically there is no excuse. You can't hide from money, right? So basically it reveals in terms of how you react to it. The other thing which is important is, there is and I think a lot of you would have read this book by Daniel Kahneman, which is basically Thinking Fast and Slow. He talks about our brain basically has two systems, right? The system one is that basically reacts fast, reacts on an instinct, reacts, um, you know, uh, it's not a lot of analysis involved. The system two is where it reacts basically slow and there is analytics involved. But the way it works in our brain is our instinct basically comes first, right? So it's that fight and flight, things that have been, that's basically instilled in our brain from, from our past conditioning. And So the first reaction is there is an instinct, right? The instinct comes first, and the analysis and the reasoning comes actually later, which surprisingly is not to decide, but to explain what we have already agreed from the instinct. So a lot of times we think we are making rational data-driven decision, but it could be pretty much your instinct, playing up in terms of how you react in that particular situation. So we can go to the next slide, I think.
Thank
So
you,
Smita, you want to?
Ajay. Yeah, sure. So, thank you for sharing, what you observed in terms of your stint as a CFO, and these observations that the instincts are first, and then about the analytics behind it. I'm sure, like you said, you didn't know at that point in time, but now you're really reflecting basis, the role of coach that you play, and also your experience that you shared earlier with the conversation with the clients that you have on topics related to money. Now, for participants of the webinar today, take a look at these questions, and I'm sure all of these sentences here is ringing a bell. You would have heard these before, right? I need more data before I can decide. I keep putting off this financial conversation. Like, why am I so uncomfortable about my fees? Like, these are very real questions which we often hear either by leaders in the boardroom, or by our clients sharing with us, right? Or also as a coach, when we question ourselves, if I'm good enough to be charging that amount. So Ajay, basis, again, coming to your experience, and when in boardrooms, when you're hearing some of this these sentences, like, this doesn't feel right, right? Like, they're really making it about feeling, and I can't explain why. Would you like to share some insight in terms of, what did you really notice when you saw these reactions coming up in the boardrooms?
Yeah, thanks, Smita. So I think what was interesting was when somebody challenges your strategy, right? People can explain in a calm manner in terms of what's changing, what basically driving that. But when it comes to money, when your budget is challenged, when the numbers are challenged, right? There is something, the reaction is pretty different in terms of how people react. It's as if um, the debate is not about the idea, but it's about um, as if the question is personally about you, right? So that's one behavior where people get very personal about money and how they react to it. And then there is other reaction, which is basically there are some leaders where you can talk to them and it's about the idea and they're okay to discuss at an idea level the merits of the idea. But there are other leaders who, for them, it's questioning their identity, right? As if you're basically question them in terms of how can you question, and there's a safety angle which is kind of threatened. So how do you respond to different situations? You have to kind of think about it, because one, you can respond in a logical way in terms of explaining what's really happening. For the other person, it's about the safety first. So you can't respond, you need to understand where the person is coming from, and then you respond to that person in terms of how they're reacting to the money discussion. So that's the second part, right? The other is, as we discussed, the instinct, right, is basically coming first, right? So basically, um, there is that fact that people are reacting out of instinct rather than looking at the data and making informed decisions, right? So this could be driven by about fear of being wrong, or they're basically they feel that there is a fear of judgment, that people will judge them, right? So what we what basically what is important in this situation and how do you react to this is basically, you need to notice a gap. You need to understand and figure out and create a little bit of a gap between how you react and how you respond in that situation. So just noticing that and creating a pause and and creating that gap, you can then basically respond, where is it coming from, right? So you need to be aware that what when you are in that situation, what instinct is driving there, what instinct is driving your decision. That's important, because you know that instinct is coming first, and then there is a and then there is a pattern. So once you notice the instinct, you can take an informed call about that.
So I see that when we say about instinct, it's more like also in boardrooms when people are saying about, I need a strategy, that might just appear like a tool, but when it is more, in depth when we go, then maybe it is more about the identity that needs to be known before we really take some action on it.
Yes.
And Ajay, there is a question on the chat. If you can, it's related to what you were sharing. Maybe it is, you can pick this up and respond to it.
Yeah. So see, instincts, when we say, when we talk about instinct, and which is another word is, the gut feel, right? I feel that I can, I react in a certain way. We are not saying that instincts are necessarily bad. You know, our brain reacts in a certain way because there are so many decisions our brain takes. It cannot use the system to, which is like, think about this as a compute, right? You don't want to use your compute for regular decisions that is should be on autopilot, right? Which is where the system one comes in, and it basically helps us not even worry about the compute and just take decisions which are just routine decisions. You don't want, that's where the system one can be very effective. The system two is where you need to engage when you have decisions which are, involve more analytics, more, you have to, think through that decision, and and if the decision is coming from instinct, that may or may not be the right decision. So you need to understand where the decision is being driven. Now, the sorry, your question was, each instinct needs a different approach. uh, I think instinct is going to be this, pretty much the same, the way we are going to react. Though, of course, the underlying, as I said, the decision which is driving that instinct could be different. So if it's a regular decision, we don't need to think too much. So we need to, the more we automate it, the better it is, right? We don't need to be, uh, thinking through those kind of decisions. But where we need to understand is where we need to pause and bring the data and the analytics and make sure that we're not using our instinct, where we need to have put a little bit thought behind our decisions, which are more critical.
Yeah. And I'm reminded of Viktor Frankl's quote, which says, "Between stimulus and response is a space, and in that space is my choice." I'm not exactly quoting, but that is what is
That's a good
about.
point.
Right? It is about that space, and it's about the choice. So pause is my choice. However, for me to become aware as to what those feelings are, and also to observe that, am I just going ahead and based on that feeling really taking an action, or based on that feeling it is asking me to get deeper to understand as to what the depth of it is, and then take decisions accordingly.
Absolutely.
All right. So moving forward, in terms of anything else, Ajay, on this that you would like to add on the awareness mirror, the hidden mirror?
No, I think let's go to the reveal, slide on this one, and maybe people can recognize some of the, questions.
Yes. So, Yamini, to the next slide. Yeah, this one. So here, we just gave some examples in terms of when somebody says, this doesn't feel right, I can't explain why. And perhaps this is just one of an example for us for this webinar. I'm sure, when you are listening to such statements saying, this doesn't feel right, I can't explain why, you may also think something else. But as an example, what we have given here is, my instinct may have already decided, the analysis is catching up. look at the other one. I said yes immediately, and I don't know why. Now, when we want to, try and understand the underlying of when somebody does like that, like immediately said yes, perhaps it may be something in the room made me want to be, generous, or just say yes or safe. Somebody else had given that idea, and that was a person of authority, and I wanted to just say the same thing, and I just said yes. I want to be in the good books of someone, and I said yes. So perhaps there can be multiple, responses to this. But what we are really trying to understand here is, when such a need arises, what does it take for us to pause and understand what is the revealing idea behind what just was said? Yeah. Ajay, again bringing, I'm just wanting to check with you as to what is your suggestion. I know we already covered in terms of, pause as a habit, but anything else do you want to add here?
So I think just as I said, just being aware of it and realizing where that decision is coming from, right? I think that is important. Just being able to uh, just not be on autopilot and understand that some decisions are already taken for you, and you're reacting from your instinct and you're justifying it. So you need to be just aware on which decisions uh, you segregate based on how you bring the analysis, and where you just go with your gut.
Great. All right. So moving on, and in that, from that stage of awareness and then pause, the next mirror we are talking about is the pattern recognition. So in order for us to, and Ajay is going to elaborate on it, just take a look at some of, the sentences here again on the slide, which says, we need more reserves before we invest. It's not the right time yet. I leave the financial decisions to my CFO. Right? These are very common things which we often hear, and it really talks about as patterns of leadership. Ajay, again calling you here to just give some insights for us in terms of what should we be aware of when such patterns arises.
Yeah.
What will help us?
So I think the patterns are obviously, recurring behavior, right? So they are serving a useful purpose. Um, where what we can do is basically let's look at, what we can, let's look at the type of, pattern that can be formed, and maybe then we can discuss in terms of how do we look at and evaluate these patterns. So, we have these six different, statements. What I have looked at is basically I've divided this into four different patterns. So if you go to the next slide, Yamini. Yeah. So, as I said, there are patterns that are formed once we, based on our past behavior, but we can categorize that into four different categories that I've created. So basically, there is one is a hoarder, right? Basically, it looks like, so they are holding resources. It looks like prudence when you look at it. It's a prudent behavior. Um, it may be driven from safety, or it may be driven from, a loss of. So there is a loss aversion which is going on. So a lot of these patterns or the decisions uh, we form to avoid the loss rather than, to maximize the gain. Because I think one of the research basically shows that uh, humans, we as humans basically fear. Uh, we feel the pain of loss twice as much as we feel, when we gain something. So we are always trying to kind of, minimize our loss. right? And this is where that pattern shows. Now, there is another pattern which you would notice that there is, you would have noticed with the leaders, there is something called a performer, right? It on the surface, it looks like somebody who takes bold decisions, who is confident, who's basically, investing in a lot of initiatives for the company. But it could be that it's coming from where their worth is tied to, how they appear, their appearances, right? So basically, it could be, loss of relevance, that they want to be visible, they don't want to lose the relevance. So that's where the underlying fear could be, right? So just knowing the pattern can basically help us classify that. Then there is the avoider, right? So which is where we saw a statement saying I delegate to my CFO, right? So I'm not a numbers person. That's because potentially one of the reason could be that money carries a charge, right? You feel a little conflicted. You feel that it creates, a debate or a fight or a argument with people, and you want to, protect yourself. So it could be a self-protection mechanism. And then there is overgiver, right? Which we also see in coaches, and we'll talk about that, right? We want to discount, we want to absorb the cost, and it could be, it feels like uh, that worth may be tied to being needed, or it could be because you don't want loss of relationship, right? So there is a pattern, there is an observed behavior, and then there is an underlying uh, thing which may be driving it, which we need to be aware. So how and which pattern do we, fall in? Uh, we need to be aware of, so that we know that, we're not operating on an autopilot in terms of our pattern, taking over. So that's where this becomes useful in terms of the framework. So if you go to the next, um, yeah, so just also, Actually, Smita, why don't you want to take this slide, and I will, take the next slide.
Yeah, sure. So again, we have some answers in terms of the perhaps interpretation of the sentences, which is I leave the financial decisions to my CFO, and then money conversations may feel dangerous to me in ways I haven't examined. Right. So or if the discount part, I may have needed them to like me more than I needed the money, and it can mean different things for different people. I mean, the responses may be really different here. What we are really trying to understand is in terms of the patterns and these the four segments which Ajay just now spoke about, can once we become aware of it, can we name it and categorize us in one of those four patterns? And so once that recognition of the pattern is done, then we go to the next mirror in terms of saying that what needs to be done next. Yeah, you can go ahead, Yamini, to the next one. Yes.
So, the three patterns we spoke about, I spoke about when we started, right? What we kind of, what I noticed, the budget fight, right? So if you go back and look at the pattern, the budget fight could be a hoarder who's basically protecting safety, right? The comparison, it could be a performer who's protecting his relevance, right? So he basically, in terms of visible decisions and visible spendings, uh, to protect your relevance. And then there is this unnecessary discount part, which could be an overgiver protecting the relationship. So once you, kind of understand the pattern, you can, understand your own pattern, and also you can, like people you work with, you can understand where they're coming from, and that basically improves in terms of how do you deal with them. If you go to the next slide, Yamini. So what is the use of the pattern, right? So it's not like, do I have a pattern? Everybody has a pattern because, that's regular, that's natural to happen, when over a period of time. But the question is my current decision responding to the current situation or to my pattern? So is there a, autopilot, which is basically I'm just responding that's the way I have always done, or am I really, taking care of the current situation and responding according to how the current situation is? So I think that's where where the insight, or where, a key tool that we can use in terms of how do we, respond to that particular situation, and be aware of our pattern.
Yeah. And I think this question is so powerful, right? Is this decision responding to the situation or to my pattern? A constant reflection would help us to know and understand more of our own patterns. Also, Ajay, I just see, a couple of them are responding, coaches are responding on in the chat, and they are also identifying, their own patterns. So Ajay is going to, share this presentation with you after the webinar. So don't worry to take notes and all the description of all those patterns. You'll have it in your emails after the webinar is done.
Absolutely.
Yes. All right. Now moving on. So from that recognition, now we are moving to the third mirror, which is about the money story, and one of my favorite mirrors of all the four. So again, inviting you to take a moment to read, the statements here on the slide. And also, if you are resonating and relating to any of those here, I don't talk about money. I feel guilty spending on myself even when I can afford it. So this was me. Definitely, I can resonate with this one. I work hard, I just never seem to get ahead. Any other, looking at this money story, any reflections of your own money story which you would like to share with us? Feel free to put it on the chat.
I think that'll be really good, insightful to know, like, if somebody else has any other uh, insights on that, or how they look at it.
Yeah. I think one of the things, Ajay, I'm reflecting on is uh, when I'm, in the Indian households, and I'm just talking about from this lens, um, there is a lot of silence when it is discussions around money. Uh, there are still conservative families where women are not included in money decisions. Parents don't talk about money in front of children. So I mean, I have, like, when I was growing up, I have never had money conversations with my parents. Post my 12th grade, I was on my own. And then there was a lot of challenge, even to spend, maybe a small amount, as I'm just saying, 100 rupees in the Indian context. So, because that was the relationship with money. And now, of course, things have changed. I am different with my kids, knowing that, it's not really about uh, the age, but it's really about kids should know about money. There's a famous book, I'm sure most of you know about it, which is Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And I had gifted that to my teenager son, just so that he understands and has some financial, understanding and knowledge. And it talks about a lot around that. So I'm sure, when you're thinking about money and a story, you're able to relate to your own story, and now how are you seeing it? Yeah. With that thought, Ajay, again, over to you in terms of, what exactly, when all of us have stories, right? Like, that's not something which we can let go of, but the awareness of the story, and then how do we go ahead with that?
I think, as you mentioned, what happens in our families, right? So these stories are basically, our experience with money is essentially from our environment, from our family, from what we observe around us, right? And these are called, actually, there is research around it. There are psychologists who call it money scripts, right? So everybody has these money scripts which are running. These are formed much earlier than we even could read financial numbers, because we have observed it, right? There is, as you said, there is money is a, in some lot of cases, is like a hush-hush topic. You don't talk about it. You just, and you end up, but you observe. The kids observe, we observe what's really, how our parents are responding to it, how, they are with us in terms of money, what kind of statements, they give around money when we ask for money, or, when there are important decisions that come in, how they react. So I think all of that basically is something that, we absorb as our children absorb as basically what it is. And there is no education that happens either in school or at home in terms of talking about money. We all work for money, we never talk about it, which is really, amazing in terms of if you think about it. That it's such an important thing that we need to do. So, those stories and the scripts are basically defining in terms of how we are thinking about money, right? Something very interesting. I know a lot of people would have read this book by Morgan Housel called. It's a book called Psychology of Money. If you have not read it, I think uh, please go ahead and read it. It's written in a very conversational way, and it just basically talks a lot of common sense. But one of the things he talks about is basically that no one is crazy, right? We think that everybody's like somebody has taken a decision about money. They have invested in certain speculative assets, so they've basically given away their money, or whatever decision they've taken. There is a story, there is a background, there is a justification, there is a their own experience, their own world in which they have taken the right decision, right? Because that's how their experience has been. So that's basically where one of the insight about money. Then the other thing is basically uh, we see in leadership there are people who have enough money, there is enough and more money, right? There is this comparison, and in terms of comparing ourselves to somebody else who's probably doing better or much better than or slightly better than from us, or from the other leaders. And the story there is, the fear. When you don't have money, is the fear of survival. When you have money, then the fear shifts from survival to comparison. It's you're trying to get your reference or your relevance based on some kind of a benchmark, or a reference benchmark, right? Comparing to others, and unfortunately, that's not something that works, because there's always somebody who's going to be having more money than you. Yamini, can you go to the next slide, please? I think there is some slides that I've covered there. Yeah, so I think I mentioned that. This is the Morgan Housel code. Can you go to the next one? Yeah, this is basically, I was just talking about how, leaders compare. They may be financially secure, financially successful, but if you change your reference point to somebody else, uh, it's a it's a never-ending loop, right? There's always somebody with a bigger figure. Can you go to the next, please? Yeah, so that's the some of the reveal patterns. Smita, you want to
Yeah.
talk some of
Yes.
these?
Sure. So again, when we look at the responses here, and also when people, if they say, I feel guilty spending on myself, even when I can afford it. And the question to all of you as leaders and coaches here, just think of a situation when a client in front of you says something like this. What would be your response in terms of, how would you respond to this? Where would you really go when somebody say, I feel guilty spending on myself, even when I can afford it? Can we hear, or, on the chat, one or two responses? I see most of you as coaches here. I don't talk about money. Okay. What kind of, Suzanne says, what kind of spending does make you feel good, maybe what are you saving the money for, or maybe what is that costing you? Yeah. And also, so great that, thank you, Suzanne, for your response there. Um, just read one or two more there. I'm not really motivated by money. Isn't it really talking something about deeper in me of my identity with the beliefs that I carry with me? Yeah. I would be curious about what is behind the guilt, right? Maybe there is a pattern, maybe there is a belief. So, Ajay, what are your thoughts and
I
insights?
think this is something very interesting, right? So I think everybody has a story, and this is something, the work that needs to be done, at our own level in terms of understanding and kind of, um, thinking through what were some of the scripts, or what were some of the thoughts, or what were some of the behavior you noticed, while growing up. For example, right, one of the things you can do, um, you know, where money story is coming up, when you know that there is something impacting, is when there is a decision or there is a money decision that you need to take, and you feel an emotional pull, right? You feel, there is a strong emotion. There is something that is basically not feeling right. You're emotionally charged. There is a story which is there, which is basically, where this is probably coming from. There is something, in the past, in the experience that you've had, in what you've been basically, the discussions you've seen, which is potentially, creating that emotional pull. And understanding that and being aware of it is the work that we need to do. Because otherwise, while we think that these scripts happen, and we may not be aware. A lot of people are not even aware of where these decisions are coming from, right? These are scripts which are just unconsciously running. And we could be sitting in boardroom, we could be sitting with clients. These scripts, are constantly with us. That's basically what is driving our decision. And if you combine it with the fact that, our instinct, is basically react first, and you have money story. I mean, that's a combination that could basically drive in terms of how you are reacting or responding to your money story. And the one has to do the work there in terms of really understanding that emotion and where is it coming from.
Great. Thank you. Yamini, to the next one. Now, we've seen okay, I think this is a powerful question. Ajay, I'm sure you want to
Yeah,
cover
I think
this.
that's what I was talking about, the pull,
Yeah,
the emotional pull, right? And I think the real question is it responding to today's reality or yesterday's experience, right? Is it just like, I think, like Tracy, I think I saw, she mentioned that, where is the guilt coming from? So if you have, like, for example, people who may have a lot of money today, right, they may still feel guilty spending on themselves. So is it a reality in terms of your financial situation? If that is not the reality and you have the money, but you still feel the guilt, where is that guilt coming from? That is
brilliant.
something we need to kind of think through, right? And,
Yeah,
and understand.
absolutely. I think this is one of the best questions from this presentation. Is this responding to today's reality or yesterday's experience? Um, Moving on to the last mirror, and very, very significant for us as leaders and as coaches, which is about for now for coaches in the room here. Again, these sentences here on the screen, not very unfamiliar, right? Like you would have seen talking about money feels like, is it worth it? I believe in the work. I hate the sales conversation. So I want to do coaching, but uh, charging money for this doesn't really feel the right thing. So I have spoken to so many coaches and also prospects, right? Like who keep questioning, can I can I charge this much, or how much do I charge? Like always that self-doubt around money, to be saying, am I good enough to be charging this money? So I had this conversation with a coach who actually grew up in an orphanage, and she was, through her life sponsored by someone for her education, right? And now doing extremely well in corporate life and wants to now shift to coaching as her, and wants to make this as her living. Now when that decision, but the belief around money, that relationship with money is very different for her, because for what she has seen while she was growing up. And she says, I find it so difficult to quote an amount for my services, because I am someone who was at the receiver's end all through my journey of education and stuff. And there is where the 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 coach's hat comes in, right? Like maybe something which you have that as a belief, but if you continue holding on to that belief, is it still going to serve? I'm sure, again, for you as coaches, whatever journey that you're in, it normally happens right at when we start making business out of this and really want this to be our source of living. But maybe, as we are in it for a period of time, we also learn to navigate, and our own money story also changes as we evolve as a coach. So moving maybe Yamini to the next slide. Ajay, do you want to again share some insights here?
Yeah, I think something that you've shared here is very powerful, right? Uh, where basically the coach has said that sometimes while you know so I had a discussion. I was sharing with Smita. I had a discussion with the coach, and she's a pretty senior coach, um, who basically thinks that she deserves much more than what she's charging. She's aware of what the market is. She knows that she can charge that much. So we had a discussion about why, what's blocking her from charging. But then she made also a statement saying, "But sometimes I wonder if I should be charging at all, because my clients are also helping me. They are letting me do the work I love." Right. So that's a very powerful statement, right? So there is this genuine care, and the intent a lot of people get in is because they genuinely, like to help. There is a caring side of it, uh, which is in conflict with what we need to do to make it sustainable, right? So there is that tension between, you know, can I charge somebody? But if I'm charging, it's not right because it's a helping profession. How will they think about it? There is this thing about worth, my self-worth. Am I charging the right amount? Do I deserve that much? There is this thing about, am I adding that much value that I should be charging, that much? There is a thing about identity. I mean, can I relate um, to a person who charges money, because that's not who I am, right? So there is this conflict, genuine conflict, which is basically happening with a lot of people, right? In terms of how with coaches, which is basically how they think about their profession and think about money, right? One of the things we can do, right, is basically let's look at the four mirror framework that we discussed. Maybe where is it coming from? So if you think about uh, when something comes up, there was a statement saying when it talks about fees, I get uncomfortable, right? So that's the mirror one, which is the instinct, which is basically playing in. Then there is this thing about that you're constantly undercharging or underpricing, giving discounts to clients, which they may or may not be asking, right? So we discussed this framework in mirror two, which is the overgiver, right? So you're basically trying to overcompensate or give discounts because you feel uh, it could be a worth issue, or it could be because you generally don't want a loss of relationship. Again, I'm not saying that that is how everybody is. I'm just basically just putting a premise there, and everybody has to kind of explore their own story in terms of where is it sitting for all of them, right? And then I think the other part is the belief that the fair value is in tension with genuine caring, right? So that may be from the mirrored three, which is our own story, right? The fact that there is a conflict between charging and caring, that it could be the some of the beliefs that we need to our money story, right, is something we need to kind of evaluate and figure out, and do the work there in terms of understanding where our money story is coming from, um, and then basically uh, understand. uh, I think that's something, if we do, we get a framework in terms of engaging with clients in a much better way. Because there are clients who are looking for our help in terms of having this discussion. If we have not sorted our own story, we cannot, or we will either avoid or not have those conversations. So let me just
Yeah.
pause here and see, Smita, if you
Yeah,
want to.
absolutely, Ajay. I think that's such a valid point, right? ICF core competency, the coaching mindset is really about the coach's mindset. And if we've not done enough work on ourselves as coaches, for us to be present and to be listening to the client at that level may really be challenging, right? Like we may get caught up on our own stories while we learn the art of keeping it aside. But we know that if we have not resolved our own money story, we may not be able to do justice with our questions to our client sitting in front of us with money anxiety. That's a very, very valid point. All right, so we're just coming, to our close of the time. So Ajay, basis these the four mirrors that we saw, and then really ending it with the fourth mirror, which is the coach's mirror. Anything else? Do you want to categorize basis, the first slide which we saw? Is there any closure, that you would like to do?
I think if we go to the next slide, Yamini.
Yeah.
So I think we discussed it, that you can't just avoid your money conversation. It walks into your session, right? And money story is part of your coaching. It's not a separate work. You have to basically sort this out to get it right. Yamini, if you can move to the next slide, please.
The one after that, we're
Yeah.
kind of done with this, or the
So I think, yeah, so this is basically, we kind of talked about it. What meaning does money hold in this relationship for me and for the client, right? So they are coming with their own money story, their own biases, their own instincts, and their own patterns. And you are holding your own patterns and your own conversations. So there is some resolution that needs to happen for us, to have these conversations with our clients. And that's the work we need to do. Yami, if you can go to the next. So just to bring this to a kind of a closure, we talked about four mirrors and four stages of insight, right? So first mirror is hidden mirror, and then basically the awareness part we talked about. You need to be aware of what is the instinct which is arriving before the logic. Then there is a pattern recognition, in terms of, so that you recognize the pattern, so we're not running on autopilot. We connected the behavior to a story, which is basically the scripts that are running in our background. And of course the coach's mirror, right? You saw the work that maybe that you need to do, right? So as part of the coaching. And Yamini, if you can go to the next slide, please. So that's where money stops being a number and becomes a mirror, right? So that's how we basically can become a little bit better, acquainted with our relationship with money. Just one more slide, Yamini. Yeah. So I think the question is, what would change in your leadership, in your coaching, in your practice, or your life if you truly understand your relationship with money? The fourth question we need to reflect, and we are leaving that with you, is basically what instinct is already showing up, which is the mirror one. Is this the situation or my pattern? Right? That's the leadership pattern. Third is today's reality or yesterday's experience. And the fourth is, what meaning does money hold here for me and for them? So I think that's the concluding, the last slide, Smita. Anything you
Absolutely.
want to add?
No, just I would like to, say this. Thank you so much, Ajay, for, these wonderful insights today. Um, I'm sure most of you, as you've gone through, stayed with us through the webinar, you would have seen that not many things are new here, but it's just that we are connecting it to to money, right? Like really about money is the topic here and the psychology behind it. So I would just like to end this by saying, shine your mirrors more often, uh, really increase your awareness, and then from there, understand your stories and where the coaches had to look at it with a new perspective. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining in and staying through the webinar. We will share with you the presentation by tomorrow. Thank you so much. Good
Thank you,
night. Have a
everyone.
great day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Ajay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Smita. Thanks,
It's a
Yamini.
pleasure.
Thank
Yamini,
you.
thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you for all the support, Yamini.
Yeah, sure.